Jackson Reed heard his own teeth grinding over the Reverend's words. He stood at the altar of a church that felt more like a gallows, waiting for a woman he didn't know. A woman he didn't want. A woman who was his only chance at survival. The whole town was watching, their whispers like snakes in the pews. They thought they were witnessing a salvation. They had no idea they were watching a man light the fuse to his own life. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, Lillian Hartwell would be his wife, the town spinster, the Boston schoolteacher who was too sharp, too quiet, too old. 28 and unmarried was a death sentence for a woman on the frontier. And marrying her felt like one for him. The banker's voice still echoed in his head, cold and final. "Marry within the month, Reed, or the ranch is mine." It wasn't a choice. It was a cage. He'd already buried a wife 6 months ago. The love of his life, Sarah, taken by a fever that swept through the valley like a thief in the night. Now he was burying his freedom, all for a piece of dirt that the drought was killing anyway. All for his 2-year-old daughter, Emma, who deserved more than a ghost for a father, and a stranger for a mother. He could feel their pity, their judgment. Poor Jackson Reed. Can't manage his own affairs. Needs the town to step in and save him. Needs a wife to raise his girl. They'd picked Lillian Hartwell as the solution, a neat, tidy answer to an ugly, messy problem. But Jackson knew this wasn't a solution. It was a trade. His soul for his land. And he was starting to suspect the price was far too high. The church doors groaned open, and every head turned. There she was, Lillian Hartwell, walking down the aisle alone. She wore a plain gray dress that did nothing to soften her severe frame. Her face was a mask of cold composure, but Jackson saw the terror in her eyes. She wasn't looking at the flowers or the smiling faces. She was looking at him, at the man who was her jailer. He knew, in that moment, that she was just as trapped as he was. 2 weeks ago, he'd been on his knees in Morrison's bank. The drought had stolen half his herd, and the debt was a rope around his neck. The banker, a man with a serpent's smile, had offered him a deal. The town committee, he'd said, felt a wife would bring stability. For the girl. And they had the perfect candidate. Jackson had laughed, a raw, broken sound. "I'm not in the market for a new wife, Morrison." Morrison's smile never wavered. "Then you'll be in the market for a new home. Marry her, or I call in the note. The choice is yours." But it was never a choice. It was an execution. What he didn't know was that Lillian had faced her own executioner just a day earlier. The school board chairman, a pig-headed man named Williams, had cornered her. "It's improper, Miss Hartwell. A woman alone. People are talking." Her spine, straight as a Boston steeple, didn't bend. "My life is my own concern." Williams had shaken his head. "Not in this town. Marry the rancher, or you're on the next stagecoach out. We can't have a woman of questionable status teaching our children." Questionable status. The words were a brand, searing the old wound. She'd fled Boston to escape that very whisper after the man she was to marry turned out to have a wife already. The scandal had killed her father, a good man dead of a broken heart. She'd come west to be anonymous, to disappear. But the past had a long reach. And now here she was, 2 prisoners walking toward the same life sentence. The ceremony was a tense, mercifully short blur. Emma cried the whole time from the front pew, a tiny, heartbroken mourner. When the Reverend grunted, "You may kiss the bride," Jackson's lips barely brushed her cheek. It felt like kissing a statue. A cold, bitter shame burned on Lillian's face. The reception was a cruel joke. The townspeople, led by the chief busybody, Mrs. Henderson, clapped him on the back. "Everyone wins!" she boomed, as if she'd just brokered a peace treaty instead of ruining 2 lives. Jackson's hand tightened around his coffee cup, his knuckles white. He'd just sold his soul for a failing ranch, and they were celebrating. The wagon ride home was a tomb of silence. Emma, exhausted from crying, finally whimpered in Lillian's stiff, awkward arms. The farmhouse, when they reached it, looked as tired and broken as Jackson felt. Clean, yes. Sarah had kept it clean. But the joy was gone. It was just a shell. He dropped their bags inside the door. The sound echoed in the quiet house. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, his voice hard and cold. "This is a business arrangement. You have your room. You take care of Emma and the house. That's it. We don't pretend this is anything more." Lillian lifted her chin, her pride a fragile shield. "That suits me, Mr. Reed, but I have my own terms. I require access to books and writing materials, and I will not be treated as a servant. I will raise your daughter as I see fit." They stood there, two enemies bound by a contract neither could break. Emma started to cry again, her little arms reaching for her father. Jackson scooped her up, the familiar weight a small comfort in the vast emptiness of his new life. He saw Lillian watch them, and for a second, a crack appeared in her composure. A flicker of raw pain. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice low. "Neither did I," she replied, turning to pick up her bag. She walked up the stairs to her new prison cell, leaving him alone in the growing dark. The town thought they'd done a good thing. They had no idea they'd just locked two strangers in a cage with a monster they couldn't see. And that monster was already starting to stir. The first week was a silent, bitter war. They were ghosts in their own home, moving through the rooms without a word, their resentment a thick fog in the air. Lillian, with a cold, military precision, started to impose her Boston order on his rustic life. She cleaned things that were already clean. She rearranged furniture. She sorted his tool shed. It was an invasion, and Jackson fought back in the only petty way he could. He'd wait until she was out of the room, and he'd move things back. A photograph of Sarah here, a book there. He was desperately trying to hold on to a past that was slipping through his fingers like dust. He was trying to erase Lillian from his home, even as she stood in the middle of his kitchen. Emma was trapped in the crossfire. The tension was a poison, making her fussy and prone to screaming tantrums. She refused to let Lillian near her. She threw her food. She cried for her father constantly, clinging to him like a life raft. Lillian, for her part, approached motherhood like an academic problem. She read to the toddler from dry textbooks. She tried to enforce a rigid schedule for naps and meals that a 2-year-old couldn't possibly understand. It was a complete disaster. One evening, after a particularly long bout of screaming, Jackson took Emma from Lillian's arms. "She doesn't like me," Lillian said. It wasn't a question, it was a flat, defeated statement. "She's just getting used to you," he lied, rocking his daughter. But they both knew the truth. Emma was a living, breathing symbol of everything they had both lost. His wife, her future. The house was haunted not by Sarah's ghost, but by the ghosts of the lives they were supposed to have. And then the storm came. It blew in from the north without warning, a blizzard that screamed like a banshee, shaking the small farmhouse until the windows rattled in their frames. Jackson had just fought his way back from the barn, the wind tearing at him when he heard it. His name. Screamed. The sound cut through the howl of the storm, sharp and terrified. It was Lillian, and it was a sound he'd never heard from her before. It was pure primal fear. He kicked the door open and ran. He found them in Emma's small bedroom. The scene froze his blood. Emma was lying on her bed, her face flushed a deep, terrifying crimson. Her tiny body was radiating heat he could feel from the doorway. Her breathing was a horrible, shallow gasp. It was the same fever, the same damn fever that had taken Sarah. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. "How long has she been like this?" Lillian demanded. Her usual icy calm was gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying focus. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "She was fine at supper," Jackson stammered, his hands shaking as he reached for Emma's forehead. It was like touching fire. He was helpless. Utterly, completely helpless, just as he had been with his wife. "We have to get her to the doctor," he said, grabbing for his heavy coat. Lillian's hand shot out, her grip surprisingly strong on his arm. "Look outside, Jackson," she commanded. "We wouldn't make it a mile. The cold would kill her before the fever did." He looked. The window was a solid wall of swirling white. They were trapped, buried alive, just like they were trapped in this sham of a marriage. But this wasn't about the ranch anymore. This was about his daughter's life. "Then what do we do?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The desperation was a physical thing, clawing at his throat. Lillian was already moving, her actions sharp and decisive. "My father was a doctor," she said, her voice impossibly steady as she began to unbutton Emma's nightclothes. "I worked as his assistant for 5 years. I know what to do, but you have to help me. You have to do exactly as I say." For the rest of that night, as the storm raged outside, the walls they had built between them turned to dust. Lillian became a general, and he became her soldier. She sent him for cool water and clean cloths. She directed him to a small locked medical kit in her trunk, a kit he never knew existed. She mixed powders and herbs with a knowledge that stunned him, forcing the remedy between Emma's lips. "Keep talking to her," she ordered, her eyes never leaving the child. "Don't stop. Let her hear your voice. They fight harder when they know they're not alone." So Jackson talked. He knelt by the bed and told Emma about the horses and the coming spring. He told her about her mother, Sarah. He told her how much her daddy loved her, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his face. And through his own choked words, he heard another voice join his. Lillian. She was singing. A soft, strange lullaby in a language he didn't know. She told Emma stories about princesses who battled fever dragons. She whispered prayers. And for the first time, Jackson saw her. He didn't see the stern schoolteacher or the Boston spinster. He saw a woman fighting for his child's life with a ferocity that matched his own. Just as the first hint of gray dawn touched the frozen windows, it happened. Emma's fever broke. Her ragged breathing eased into a deep, peaceful sleep. Jackson collapsed into a chair, the strength gone from his limbs. Lillian sat by the bed, her hand resting gently on Emma's chest, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "She's going to be fine," she said softly. And in those words, Jackson heard something that shook him to his core. It wasn't duty. It wasn't the fulfillment of a contract. It was love. A fierce, protective love for his little girl. "Thank you," he said. The words felt too small, too hollow for what she had done. She looked up at him, her tired eyes holding his. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first one he had ever seen, and it transformed her face. In that moment, he realized with a sudden jolt that Lillian Hartwell was beautiful. "My father always said that healing is just a form of fighting," she said. "You just have to care enough to fight for someone, even when you think you've already lost." The storm broke the next morning, leaving the world silent and buried in white. Inside the farmhouse, the silence was different. The cold, angry quiet was gone, replaced by something new. Something fragile. With Emma playing on the floor, her fever a memory, they shared a pot of coffee at the kitchen table. And for the first time, they spoke. Not as adversaries, but as people. She told him about her father, the doctor. About the sister in Colorado she'd traveled west to join, only to find out her help was no longer needed. She'd been stranded, alone, until the teaching job came up. He found himself telling her about Sarah, about the laughter that used to fill this house, about the fear that he would never feel that way again, that his heart had been buried with her. And then, to his own surprise, he told her the whole truth. "The ranch is failing," he confessed, the words tasting like ash. "Morrison was going to take it anyway. This marriage, it just bought me a little time. I don't know how I can hold on. Lillian listened, her gaze steady and unwavering. When he was finished, she set her coffee cup down with a firm click. I'm very good with numbers, Jackson. My father said I had a better mind for figures than any man he knew. Let me see your books. His first instinct was a surge of pride, a refusal. These were his problems, his failures. But then he saw her face, calm and competent. He remembered her in the sick room, taking command while he was falling apart. He nodded, stood up, and led her to the small, dusty desk in the corner. He opened the ledgers, the symbols of his failure, and stepped back. Lillian sat down. For 3 days, she barely moved. The kitchen table disappeared under stacks of receipts, loan agreements, and ledgers. She ate standing up. She slept for only a few hours at a time. Jackson watched her, a growing sense of awe mixing with his dread. She was a hawk circling, her mind sharp and focused, hunting for something he couldn't see. Late on the 3rd day, she looked up. Her face was pale with fatigue, but her eyes were blazing with a cold, righteous fury. This isn't a failure, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. This is a robbery. She turned the ledger toward him. Her finger, stained with ink, traced a line of figures. These numbers are lies. All of them. He's been fabricating charges for years. Cattle feed you never received. Interest rates that are illegal. Service fees that don't exist. She looked up at him, her eyes locking onto his. The drought hurt you, Jackson. But it wasn't the drought that was killing this ranch. It was your banker. Morrison has been systematically stealing from you for years. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A forced marriage to a stranger was one thing. This was something else. This was a conspiracy that reached back years, a web of deceit spun right under his nose. But why? Jackson asked, his head reeling. Why the marriage? Lillian's expression hardened. Because the theft wasn't enough. He needed the land. He pushed you to the brink of ruin, creating a crisis so the town committee would have a reason to force your hand. He didn't want you to have a wife who would help you. He wanted you to marry an outsider, a woman with no family, no allies, who would be too scared or too ignorant to ever look at the books. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The marriage wasn't a solution offered by the town. It was the final move in Morrison's chess game. It was the weapon designed to deliver the killing blow. They had assumed she would be a pawn. They had no idea they'd just handed a sword to a queen. We need undeniable proof, Lillian said, her voice like steel. Proof that will hold up. I can show the fraud, but a man like Morrison has allies. He'll bury us in lies unless we have him trapped. Jackson shook his head, the old despair creeping back. He owns this town, Lillian. Mrs. Henderson, Williams on the school board. They're all in his pocket. No one will speak against him. Fear dies in the light, she replied, a sharp, determined glint in her eye. And I guarantee you, Jackson, you are not his only victim. We just have to find the others. Their first stop was Silas Croft's ranch, a place even more weathered and worn than Jackson's. Silas was an old man, bent by years of hard work and quiet shame. When Jackson explained what they suspected, Silas just stared at the floor and shook his head. Leave it be, son. You can't fight him. But then Lillian spoke. She didn't plead or threaten. She simply laid out the evidence piece by piece. She showed him a forged receipt from Jackson's ledger for phantom cattle feed, then pulled out one of her own from Silas's records, a perfect match. She explained the illegal interest calculation, her voice calm and clear, the voice of a teacher explaining a difficult problem. She treated him not as a fool, but as an equal who had been cheated. Silas stared at the papers, his hands trembling. The tough, wary facade he showed the world crumbled. He did it to me too, he whispered, his voice thick with an old, bitter anger. Told me I was a failure. My own boy left, thinking his father had run this place into the ground. It was Morrison all along. That was the first crack in the dam. With Silas's testimony, 2 more ranchers came forward. Men who had been slowly bled dry by Morrison, each believing he was the only one, each drowning in private shame. Lillian worked tirelessly, compiling their stories, creating a fortress of evidence, brick by sworn brick. The confrontation was set for Friday morning. When they walked into the bank, they walked in together. Jackson felt a new strength with Lillian by his side. They were not a broken rancher and his unwanted bride. They were a team. Morrison greeted them with his usual oily smile. "Reed, and the missus, come to deposit your earnings." "We're here about your theft," Lillian said, her voice cutting through the pleasantries like a shard of ice. She spread the documents across his polished desk. Ledgers, forged receipts, the sworn, signed statements from Silas Croft and the others. She laid them out like a death sentence. Morrison's face went from pink to purple. He sputtered. He blustered. He called her a meddling city bitch who didn't understand how business was done on the frontier. Lillian didn't even blink. "I understand conspiracy, Mr. Morrison, and I know you didn't act alone. The same town committee that backed my husband into a corner, they've been helping you, haven't they? Who was it? Williams? Mrs. Henderson?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Tell me their names." Panic flared in Morrison's eyes. She had him. He was trapped. The crowd of farmers and townspeople that had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion, pressed their faces to the glass. They were watching his empire crumble. "Fine," he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. I'll fix the accounts." Jackson stepped forward, his own voice hard as granite. "You'll do more than that. You will make full restitution to every man you've cheated, and you will give the sheriff the names of your partners." They walked out of that bank and into the bright sunlight, leaving the ruins of a petty tyrant behind them. They had won. The town was buzzing, staring at them with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. That night, the farmhouse didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a home. Jackson found a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving and poured 2 glasses. "To you," he said, raising his glass. He looked at Lillian across the table, her face illuminated by the warm lantern light. "You should have been a gunslinger." She laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that filled the quiet kitchen. "They don't let women be gunslingers," she said. "But they do let them be wives." Their eyes met over the rims of their glasses, and something new passed between them. It wasn't just respect or gratitude. It was a spark. Something warm and dangerous and utterly undeniable. The war for the ranch was over. But they had just declared war on the most powerful people left in town. And the real battle hadn't even begun. In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. The anger was gone, replaced by a shy, tentative curiosity. They started to talk in the evenings, sharing stories of their past lives. He learned about the world of books and ideas she'd left behind in Boston. She learned about the rhythm of the seasons on the land, about the dreams he had for the future. The invisible line between them began to blur. A brushed shoulder in the narrow hallway. Hands touching for a moment as she passed him a plate. Each accidental contact sent a jolt through the quiet house. Jackson found himself watching her, noticing things he'd never seen before. The way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The surprising warmth in her eyes when she smiled at Emma. Emma, no longer caught between 2 warring parents, began to thrive. She was the bridge that connected their 2 lonely islands. One afternoon, she tripped and scraped her knee, and ran crying not to Jackson, but to Lillian. "Mama Lily," she sobbed. Lillian froze for a heartbeat, her eyes wide with a stunned, breathtaking emotion. Then she knelt, gently cleaning the wound and kissing it, just as a mother should. Jackson watched from the doorway, his heart aching with a complicated mix of guilt and overwhelming joy. This felt right. It felt like a family. It wasn't the family he had lost, but it was the family he was finding. Their new world was shattered by a single piece of paper. A letter arrived, bearing a Boston postmark. It was for Lillian. She read it once, her face a blank, unreadable mask. Then, without a word, she handed it to him. It was from a lawyer. Her former fiancé, the man whose betrayal had destroyed her life, was now a widower. His wife had died suddenly. He was publicly begging for Lillian's forgiveness for his youthful indiscretion. He was offering her a chance to return to Boston, to have her name restored, to take her rightful place by his side. He was offering her back the life that had been stolen from her. The letter was a bomb, and its shockwave rocked the little farmhouse to its foundations. It represented everything she had lost: wealth, respect, a world of intellectual equals, a world that couldn't be more different from the dust and hardship of a Wyoming ranch, a world without him. "What are you going to do?" Jackson asked. He tried to keep his voice neutral, but his gut was twisted in a knot of a cold, sharp feeling he didn't dare name. It felt like fear. "I don't know," she whispered, folding the letter with trembling hands. "He ruined my family. He killed my father with shame." But Jackson saw the flicker in her eyes, the ghost of a different future. The unspoken question hung between them for days, thick and suffocating. Was this life enough for her? Was he enough? The annual town dance was their first real public outing since the day they took down Morrison. His former cronies watched them with cold, hateful eyes, but the rest of the town treated them like heroes. Silas Croft and the other ranchers clapped Jackson on the back, their wives embracing Lillian. They weren't the mismatched, forced couple anymore. They were the Reeds. Lillian wore a simple blue dress someone had loaned her. With her hair softened around her face, she looked so beautiful it hurt to breathe. Jackson couldn't take his eyes off her. When he asked her to dance, her hand fit perfectly in his. "We're getting good at this," she murmured, her face close to his as they moved with the music. "At what?" he asked, his voice rough. "Pretending?" she whispered, but her eyes were smiling. They weren't pretending. Not anymore. And then the doors to the town hall flew open, and a man stumbled in, his face white with alarm. "It's the Weatherbys!" he yelled. "They're here! Sarah's parents!" Jackson's blood turned to ice. Mr. and Mrs. Weatherby. They had hated him from the day he married their daughter, a wealthy Boston family who thought a poor rancher was no better than dirt. They hadn't even come to Sarah's funeral. Why in God's name were they here now? They raced home in the wagon, a cold black dread settling over them. They saw them as they crested the last hill. Two figures, dressed in severe black, standing on their porch like vultures. And next to them stood a third man, holding a leather satchel. "We are here for our granddaughter," Mrs. Weatherby announced, her voice dripping with venom. Her eyes swept over Lillian with open contempt. "A child belongs with her proper family, not in this place with a stranger of questionable character." The third man, a lawyer, stepped forward and handed Jackson a sheaf of papers, a custody petition. They were suing for Emma. Their claim was simple and brutal. Jackson was an unfit father, proven by his financial desperation and his sham marriage to a disgraced adventuress. The town had forced him to marry Lillian to save the ranch. And now, his enemies were using that very marriage to destroy him. The custody hearing was a public crucifixion. The Weatherbys' lawyer, a silver-tongued devil from Boston, painted Jackson as a pathetic failure. A man who couldn't provide for his own child, who had entered a loveless transactional marriage to save his own skin. He twisted their fight against Morrison into an act of reckless vigilantism, claiming they had made powerful enemies and put Emma in constant danger. Then he turned on Lillian. He had somehow dug up the old scandal from Boston, painting her as a woman of loose morals, a desperate spinster who had entrapped a grieving widower. He portrayed her as an unstable and unsuitable guardian. The town, which had so recently hailed them as heroes, was now split. The remnants of Morrison's allies, the people they had exposed, saw their chance for revenge. One by one, they took the stand, twisting the truth, painting Jackson and Lillian in the darkest possible light. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Williams, it was a coordinated, vicious attack. Jackson watched the judge, an old traditionalist, and saw him being swayed. He saw the pity in the judge's eyes when he looked at Jackson, and the open suspicion when he looked at Lillian. They were losing. The ground was collapsing beneath them. How could they prove their marriage was real? How could they prove their love was real when its foundation was a contract? On the final day, Lillian was called to the stand. She looked so small, so alone. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. She didn't talk about money or contracts. She talked about Emma. "I did not give birth to Emma Reed," she began, her eyes locked on the judge. "But I have held her through a fever that nearly took her life. I have taught her the names of the flowers in our fields. I have rocked her to sleep when nightmares came. Love, Your Honor, is not a matter of biology. It is a matter of choice. It is about choosing to be a mother, every single day." Her voice thickened with emotion. "The Weatherbys can offer her a mansion in Boston. I can only offer her a home. I can only offer her my heart." It was powerful. It was beautiful. But Jackson knew it wasn't enough. The Weatherbys' lawyer stood, a smug, predatory smile on his face. "Mrs. Reed," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "A touching speech. You claim this deep love for the child. Yet, isn't it true that you recently received an offer to return to Boston? A proposal from your former associate to resume a life of wealth and comfort?" A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Jackson's heart stopped cold. They knew about the letter. "Did you or did you not," the lawyer pressed, moving in for the kill, "consider abandoning this so-called family for a better offer?" Lillian went pale. She was trapped. Emma's entire future, their entire future, hung on her next words. She took a deep breath. She looked past the lawyer, past the judge, and her eyes found Jackson's. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing through the silent room. "I received such an offer." The lawyer's smile widened. He had won. "And what," he sneered, "was your reply?" Lillian's gaze never left Jackson's. "My reply," she said, her voice soaring with a strength that brought tears to his eyes, "was that my rightful place was no longer in Boston. My rightful place is on a dusty ranch in Wyoming. My rightful place is with my husband, and my rightful place is with my daughter." But the lawyer wasn't finished. He had one last devastating card to play. "Your Honor," he said, turning back to the judge, "the petitioners would like to submit one final piece of evidence. A letter, written by the late Sarah Reed Weatherby, shortly before her death." He handed a document to the clerk. In it, she details her husband's financial incompetence. She expresses her grave concerns for her daughter's future in his care. And she explicitly states her wish that, in the event of her death, full custody of Emma be granted to her parents. It was a lie, a vicious, ugly lie. Sarah would never. The clerk began to read the letter aloud, and Jackson heard the words, like a knife twisting in his heart. It was Sarah's handwriting, a betrayal from beyond the grave. He looked at the judge's face and saw it was over. They had lost. The farmhouse was as quiet as a tomb. They sat at the kitchen table, a copy of Sarah's letter lying between them like a snake. The judge would deliver his ruling in the morning, but it was just a formality. Emma was upstairs, sleeping peacefully, unaware that tomorrow her life would be torn in two. Jackson felt hollowed out. He had lost his daughter, and now the memory of his first love was poisoned by this impossible betrayal. It doesn't make sense, Lillian said, her voice a ragged whisper. She hadn't taken her eyes off the letter for an hour. The handwriting is perfect, but the words, financial incompetence, fiduciary responsibility. This doesn't sound like a woman who grew up on a farm. This sounds like a man who sits behind a desk. Her head snapped up. This sounds like a banker. This sounds like Morrison. A tiny spark ignited in the suffocating darkness. Morrison? Jackson said, his voice hoarse. Think about it, she said, standing up, pacing the floor. The Weatherbees arriving out of nowhere, the coordinated attack from his allies in town. This is his revenge, Jackson. He couldn't destroy you financially, so he came for your family. He conspired with the Weatherbees. But the letter, Lillian, it's her handwriting. Is it? She countered, her eyes gleaming with a sudden fierce intelligence. Or is it a perfect forgery? Morrison had access to her signature on dozens of bank documents. When was this letter supposedly written? The lawyer said a week before she died. Lillian's eyes widened. A week before she died. Jackson, at that time, where did you keep your important papers? Your deed to the ranch? Your loan agreements? In the strong box, he said slowly. At the bank. Lillian slammed her hand on the table, a sharp crack in the silence. That's it. Sarah never wrote that letter. Morrison did. He found a blank piece of her stationery in the strong box. He forged it. This was his checkmate. If he couldn't get the ranch, he would steal the heir to the ranch and give her to his allies. It was a wild, desperate theory, but it was the only hope they had. How can we possibly prove it? Jackson asked, daring to feel a sliver of hope. Lillian's jaw was set, her face a mask of determination. We need a confession, she said, and I think I know how to get one. The next morning, an hour before the judge was set to deliver his verdict, Lillian walked into the bank. She had told Jackson to wait at the courthouse with the sheriff. This was a trap only she could set. Morrison was at his desk, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. Come to plead your case, Mrs. Reed? He sneered. I'm afraid it's a little late for that. I'm not here to plead, Lillian said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. I'm here to make you a deal. She placed the letter from her Boston fiancé on his desk, the letter offering her a new life. The Weatherbees are going to win, she stated as a fact. Jackson will be a broken man. He'll sell this ranch for nothing. You'll get what you wanted all along. But I'm leaving. I'm going back to Boston, and I need a fresh start. Morrison stared at her, confused. What does that have to do with me? Lillian leaned forward, her eyes hard. I want my share, for my silence. I know you forged that letter, Morrison. I know about your deal with the Weatherbees. I'm not going to expose you. I have no reason to. I'm done with this town. I just want enough money to disappear. It's a small price for you to pay to make sure your secret stays buried forever. It was the perfect bait, playing to his greed, his arrogance, his belief that everyone was as corrupt as he was. He started to laugh, a low, ugly sound of pure triumph. You are much smarter than I gave you credit for, schoolteacher. That letter was a work of art, wasn't it? Took me weeks to get her signature just right. The Weatherbees paid a fortune for it. They get the girl, I get a piece of the ranch when they force the sale. Everybody wins. Not everybody, a deep voice said from the doorway. Morrison spun around in his chair. Jackson was standing there, and beside him stood Sheriff Miller, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. They had been standing in the back room. They had heard every single word. The look of pure, dawning horror on Morrison's face was the most beautiful thing Jackson had ever seen. They burst into the courtroom just as the judge was adjusting his spectacles to read the final verdict. Your Honor, Jackson shouted, we have new evidence. What followed was a swift and brutal conclusion. Faced with prison for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy, Morrison confessed to the entire plot. He implicated the Weatherbees, detailing how they had hired him to create the forged letter to steal their own granddaughter. The Weatherbys were arrested in the courtroom, their faces masks of shocked, impotent rage. The judge, his own face a grim mask of fury at being so deceived, tore his original ruling in half. He dismissed the custody case with extreme prejudice, awarding sole and permanent custody of Emma to Jackson and Lillian Reed. He looked down from the bench, his eyes landing on Lillian. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice humbled. "This court, and this town, owes you a profound apology." As they walked out of the courthouse, a tiny, happy Emma held tightly between them, they were met by a cheering crowd. They hadn't just saved their family, they had saved the town. That night, for the first time, Jackson didn't lead Lillian to her separate room. He led her to his. "This wasn't how it was supposed to happen," she whispered as he gently closed the door. "No," Jackson said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He reached out and touched her face. "It's better." He was forced to marry her to save his land, but she had saved his child. She had saved his spirit. She had saved him. He had fallen in love with his wife. And when he leaned down and kissed her, not with hesitation or gratitude, but with the desperate, heartfelt passion of a man who had found his home, he knew their real story was only just beginning. 1 year later, Jackson stood on the porch, watching Lillian teach a 4-year-old Emma how to weave a crown from wildflowers. The ranch was thriving. The fields were green, the cattle were fat, and the ledgers Lillian kept were filled with black ink. But the real change was in the house. It was full of light and laughter. Lillian, pregnant with their first child together, had traded her severe gray dresses for soft blues and greens. Her face, once a mask of defensive pride, was now open and radiant with joy. She had become the heart of their community, starting a small school for the children of the surrounding ranches. The spinster from Boston had become the soul of the town. Emma ran onto the porch, holding up her lopsided crown. "It's for the baby, Mama Lily!" Lillian's face glowed with a love so fierce and pure it stole Jackson's breath. He thought of the angry, bitter man he had been at the altar, so certain his life was over. He had been so wrong. It was just getting started. That evening, they sat together on the porch swing, Emma asleep in her mother's lap. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lillian asked softly. "Our wedding?" Jackson pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her. "I think about how the town believed they were fixing a problem. They thought they were just saving a ranch." He looked at his beautiful wife, his sleeping daughter, and the peaceful land stretching out before them. "They had no idea," he whispered. "They were witnessing a miracle. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was forged in crisis and betrayal, written in account books and court documents. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. It was so much better. It was real." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of unexpected love and frontier justice.